It's okay, Angie. I answer to lots of names, so it's good. So we are really, really pleased tonight to have Kate Troll with us. Many of you know Kate. I think she's kind of just a well-known person around Southeast. But she is an op-ed columnist, an author, and a speaker on conservation and climate issues. She moved to Alaska in 1977, seeking a career in natural resource management. Altogether, Kate has worked for 22 years in coastal management, fisheries, and climate energy policy. As executive director of the Alaska Conservation Voters, Kate helped draft the creation of the Alaska Renewable Energy Fund and lobbied for the Sustainable Energy Act, a roadmap to generate 50% of Alaska's electrical energy from renewable resources by 2025. She served as executive director for the United Fishermen of Alaska and also worked as a fisheries development specialist and policy analyst for the state of Alaska. Internationally, Kate was regional fisheries director for the Marine Stewardship Council, a global eco-label program. She was elected to public office twice, serving on the Juneau Douglas Borough and the Ketchikan Borough Assembly. Kate was appointed by Governor Palin to serve on the Alaska Climate Mitigation Advisory Board and was the only Alaskan invited to participate in Governor Schwarzenegger's 2008 Global Climate Summit. She recently served on the board of directors for Renewable Energy Alaska Project. From 2010 to 2016, she was a regular columnist for the Juneau Empire and then moved on to the Alaska Dispatch News, now the Alaska Daily News, for 2 years. She remains a contributing columnist for both papers. Please join me in welcoming Kate Troll.
Hey, great to see more friends still filing in. This is nice to see a good crowd here on First Friday. Thank you to the University of Alaska Southeast for allowing me to give this talk. I have about 20 minutes of prepared remarks, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So I'm going to start off with one of the things that prompted me to want to do this talk, and that is I kept hearing that the reason why we need to open up the Arctic or the Arctic National Wildlife to oil and gas is because we need to make America energy dominant. And that just didn't set right with me, energy dominant. So regardless of where you are in the spectrum about developing offshore or in the Arctic, the path to energy dominance is not with oil and gas, it is with renewable energy and policies that reduce emissions. And that's the premise that my talk begins with. My talk also begins with knowing that most Alaskans agree with this shift. In 2017, the Nature Conservancy of Alaska did a poll, and I found it pretty amazing that 86% of Alaskans want their elected officials to support policies advancing energy efficiency and renewable energy. That's a significant majority of Alaskans wanting to move in this direction. We also see that most Alaskans don't think that government is doing enough on whatever level, local, state, or national. So it's important to recognize there's a big body of support for us moving beyond oil. And the reason we want to do that is because the world is moving on. Right now we have 195 countries agreeing to meet the terms of the Paris Climate Accord. And the path to energy dominance is away from fuels that emit significant amounts of carbon. It's interesting to note that later on, Nicaragua actually signed back on to the Paris Accord. So it's kind of hard to imagine that going it alone on the one global issue that affects energy is the path toward America becoming energy dominant. Doesn't compute. But I also want to point out, but locally, America is still in it. So at the state and local levels, we do have A lot of communities still committed to the Paris Climate Accord. Perhaps the most telling development about the future of oil comes from with the rising number of countries moving to phase out the internal combustion engine. As of now, there are 12 countries and 20 cities banning the future sales of passenger vehicles. And that includes major companies like China. China is the world's largest auto market. Japan is right behind, the third largest, and they intend to also ban the internal combustion engine. You have 8 European countries also online, and the first ban, will start in 2025. I think it's really interesting to note that, what the Chinese did to drop the price in the production of photovoltaic cells and the boom that caused in solar industry, they intend to do that next with electric vehicles. Another development affecting the future of fossil fuels is the fact that we have 42 countries and 25 subnational governments, by that states like California, that place a price on carbon. Here in the US, we don't have a tax. In fact, we have the opposite. We still have billions, like up to 20 billion, in national and state subsidies for the US oil and gas industry. Yet even with these significant subsidies, solar and wind power is now cheaper than gas and coal in many parts of the United States. This is called grid parity, when a utility can purchase cheaper electricity from renewable energies than oil and gas. And with grid parity, in many parts of the world, the marketplace is now rapidly shifting away from fossil fuels. According to the Bloomberg News Energy Finance, in 2014, and this is, mind you, the year before we signed the Paris Climate Accord, electricity from solar and wind was cheaper than coal and gas in probably just 1% of the world. Today, only 5 years later, solar and wind provide the cheapest source of electricity in 2/3 of the world. And it's expected within the next 5 years, these sources will expect to provide the cheapest new electricity in the entire world. So let me kind of repeat that. Let's sink that in a little bit. So within 5 years, solar and wind will be cheaper than gas anywhere in the world. Take, for example, China, who's on a mission to build 100 of these Panda Power solar plants. Look closely, and those are solar panels. And a young high school girl decided that came up with the idea of designing them in the shape of pandas. And so China is now about to put 100 of these all across their countryside, and each one of these power plants will provide enough electricity for 10,000 households. Furthermore, the world at large does not necessarily need to develop new reserves of oil and gas. There are many credible analyses that have determined that a significant number, up to 2/3 of the world's known and accessible fossil fuel reserves should not be burned if there's any chance to meet the terms of the Paris Climate Accord and avoid complete climate catastrophe. This is what is known as the crude awakening. Yes, that it actually featured in the Economist magazine that talks about the harsh reality that a significant amount of known oil needs to stay in the ground and not burned. And as a result, major international oil companies face the risk of having stranded assets. So you tell me where the path to energy dominance lies. Let's just see a little show of hands here. Which would you choose? The Panda solar power plants or an oil refinery? Releasing more methane. It's a no-brainer. One would think so, yes, but still. Our state leaders want to hitch Alaska's future to a dubious resurgence in oil. And here, as an Alaskan who's been here for a long time, I get it. It's what we've always done and what we still do. We look for more oil to save us from the expected and ongoing decline of a 30-year-old field. Prudhoe Bay was estimated to yield 10 billion barrels of oil, and instead, in 2013, it produced 12 billion barrels. So Prudhoe Bay, even though it has exceeded our expectations, but it is still an old, declining field. And something that we Alaskans don't really want to quite acknowledge. So what do we always want to do? We'll look for more oil, or we'll look to another external event, like the Iraq War, or what's going on in Saudi Arabia right now to raise the price of oil. And I think one of the reasons why there's such a disconnect between world trends and Alaska, between acting on climate change and not, it's because after decades of having up to 80% of our government funded by oil revenues, and it's a lot less now, as a good friend of mine pointed out. I think we're down about 35%. But nonetheless, we've always come to rely on oil funding our state government. And we also get a check from them. So I realize part of the reason why we keep having to have this discussion is because oil is somewhat ingrained in our collective psyche as Alaskans. It's hard to think beyond oil. And as an Alaskan who arrived here at the start of the pipeline boom, I fully understand how much oil and gas is given to us and how much it has transformed our state. After funding state government, building our roads, providing thousands of jobs, and giving us an annual check, it's hard to imagine Alaska beyond oil. But if we want a realistic future that accounts for climate change and where the rest of the world is going, we can and must think beyond oil. And I'm here today to help you do this. When I first came to Anchorage in 1977, that is not me, but it captures the moment. You know, I just had graduated from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and I was really ready to embrace my new life here. But what was the first job I had? The only job I could find initially, and that was driving a taxi for Checker Cab. So I got to see Alaska and Anchorage up close in rapid transition. I got to see the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I remember the days when, you know, in Anchorage there maybe were, you know, 2 restaurants and they were always crowded. And so I kind of arrived pretty naive, just like this young woman who's hitchhiking outside the Kit Kat Club. Yeah. And I thought that because I was driving a taxi during the day, that I would see less of the spurious nightlife. Duh, in winter in Anchorage, it's dark a lot. So, needless to say, I saw the rough side of Anchorage and Alaska in transition and finally got a real job. But for me, I see a transformed Anchorage, you know, much more prosperous city with a revitalized downtown, good schools, healthcare, parks, and trails. And I'm here to assure you that as much as Anchorage has improved and stabilized since 1977, the year oil first came through the pipeline, so too has our other key industries. And let's take a quick tour of what has changed since then. At the time of the pipeline boom, there were no quota programs for halibut, pollock, or crab. And once Alaska fisheries switched over from the race for fish structure to a quota program that allowed for months of fishing instead of days, stability and new opportunities abounded in the seafood industry. Just look at the price of halibut now. Through the community development quota program and regional marketing efforts, there's not one part of Alaska that is not touched significantly by the economic power of the seafood industry. And since the time of Prudhoe Bay production, the peak of Prudhoe Bay production, the salmon industry had to weather the market disruption of farm salmon. And guess what? We came through stronger, with more improved quality, and many more value-added products. A friend of mine here in the audience knows what a struggle it was during those days, but we are much stronger now in the salmon industry as a result of it. And we also have an expanding shellfish industry and interest in growing sea vegetables for foreign markets. So I've listed a few of the what I consider some of the more impressive economic numbers here about the seafood industry. 56,800 workers directly employed, an ex-vessel value of $1.7 billion, that's the value that goes to fishermen, and then that translates into $4.7 billion in first wholesale. So as you get a sense of things, how the seafood industry has changed since the pipeline days, the commercial fishing industry in Alaska is truly extraordinary. And every single one of our major fisheries is now been independently certified as sustainable. And in my words, and actually this is one of the few things I agree with Senator Dan Sullivan, the seafood industry, we are the superpower of sustainable seafood in the world. And before I move on to the next economic sector, I do need to recognize, because this talk is in the context of climate change, that we do have challenges with the fishing industry, with warming oceans and acidifying oceans. But I look at that as one more reason to be compelled to take action. But nonetheless, I think it's still important to acknowledge the maturity and the evolution of the seafood industry since the pipeline days. The next economic sector that has blossomed in the same time period is tourism. And according to the Institute of Social and Economic Research, also known as ICER, tourism has been one of the fastest growing basic industries, increasing at an estimated 5 to 7% annually. Essentially, tourism has transformed the economy of towns from Ketchikan to Seward to Fairbanks and all the way to Nome. At the time of the pipeline, tourism was just a fledgling industry with a few thousand visitors. Last year, we had more than 2 million visitors, and the projections for the next few years all point upwards. With the opening of the Red Dog Mine, the Greens Creek Mine, and the Kensington Mine, mining continues to be a significant contributor to Alaska's economy. And the other core industry that has remained strong since the pipeline days is the construction trade. And according to ICER, the construction trade is Alaska's third largest industry, employing nearly 18,000 workers with a payroll of over $1 billion. And it contributes $7 billion to the Alaska's economy. The construction trade is expected to remain vibrant, especially if deferred maintenance and infrastructure projects become government priorities. So these are our economic strengths that we had at the time oil was in the pipeline, and we still have them now. And they're much stronger and in a better position than they were. But now let's look at the industries and companies that we didn't have at the time of the pipeline. At the top of this list is healthcare and air cargo. And according to the Alaska Department of Labor and Workforce Development, Alaska's healthcare industry has grown steadily during the past 20 years, and that the trend is expected to continue as many of us seniors continue to age. In 2010, the healthcare industry provided over 30,000 jobs. That's impressive. And while flying into Anchorage for healthcare or other needs, many of you may have noticed all the air cargo activity around the Ted Stevens Airport. But did you know it's the 4th in the world in terms of a volume of cargo going through it? That's impressive in my book. Another major wrinkle in Alaska's economy is the maturation and success of Alaska's native corporations, both regional and village corporations. Today, there are 20 native corporations that regularly make the top 49 list for Alaska's most successful businesses. And according to Governor Walker's Rural Affairs Advisor, Gerald Godfrey, not only do Alaska native corporations compete in virtually every major industry, they do so with exceptional results. In addition to acting as powerful drivers in the state's economy, native corporations provide a lot of direct benefits to their shareholders in the form of employment, scholarships, and apprenticeships. We even have 2 native corporations, Shugash and Sea Alaska, making millions through carbon offsets. In essence, Alaska's statewide economy has been the beneficiary of the maturation and success of the native corporations, and we have every reason to believe this success will continue. Add to this list the state-of-the-art telecommunications network that serves the entire state, the growth of the university system, and an expanding arts and entertainment industry, and you see that Alaska has significantly diversified and stabilized since big oil first came into our lives. As a former elected official and engaged resource professional, I've stayed close to economic development for the past 40 years. And the Alaska I know and love has more than one economic driver. Yes, we may have been funded by oil, but let's not forget we were founded on fish. Alaska's largest employer then and now. Now with wired wilderness, a thriving healthcare industry, a global cargo center, and millions of visitors every year, we are so much more than oil. We can build on these strengths. We can move into the clean energy economy where the rest of the world is going. We do not have to be left behind. And now I'd like to talk about how we can move into that clean energy economy. It's often said that the cheapest energy is the energy you don't burn. And according to Chris Rose, who is the executive director of the Renewable Energy Alaska project, REAP is its shorthand acronym, Alaskans are spending about $5 billion a year on heating, electricity, and transportation, and we waste about 20% of that. This means we're burning about $1 billion worth of energy every year without any benefits. With a program to finance and promote energy efficiency measures, Alaskans could instead work toward recirculating that $1 billion in our economy, creating thousands of jobs in the process. As Chris Rose points out, we're money and jobs ahead just by eliminating waste. But perhaps the biggest opportunity for Alaska to prosper in the clean energy economy comes from our wealth of renewable energy. According to the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, which is part of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, geothermal, wind, tidal, wave, hydro, and even solar and biomass resources have the theoretical potential to not only meet the majority of Alaska's in-state needs, but also provide tremendous economic and strategic opportunities for the state and the nation. You might be surprised to learn that Alaska has vast experience in running small microgrids throughout rural Alaska. A microgrid is where you have smaller communities connected to each other that aren't part of a larger electrical grid system. And in fact, Alaska happens to be home to 40% of the world's rural integrated microgrids. And because much of the developing world is not connected to major energy grids, Alaska can export this expertise around the world, and REAP is a big promoter of this idea. We can not only export our microgrid knowledge, but that gained by the pioneering cold climate housing research at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. In the digital age, it's in what some economists call the sharing economy, it's all about flows of knowledge to connect to the world at large. It's about knowledge spurring investment and innovation. And we have a tremendous knowledge base here in Alaska to do that very thing. But speaking of flows of knowledge, you might be surprised to learn that most economists in the state agree that Alaska is still in a recession, but it's no longer a function of lower oil production. It's a function of not closing the fiscal gap. According to Bill Popp, who is the CEO of the Anchorage Economic Development Corporation, the oil recession in Alaska lasted about as long as expected, and we are out of that recession. In his recent 3-year outlook given to Anchorage businesses, he explained, then after the oil recession, we got caught up in a policy recession that extends back years. That policy recession has been rooted in the inability of our state government to come up with a long-term fiscal strategy, and thereby creating uncertainty in the business community and to invest. And in regards to the economic outlook he provided, he expects this policy recession to continue. While this is not necessarily good news, it does come with a silver lining. The policy recession is fixable. We made it through the oil recession, and now we must do the same in getting out of this fiscal policy recession. And solving the fiscal gap is the first and most fundamental step toward moving beyond oil. And while I don't want to get into all the details of how to solve the fiscal gap, because that would be another whole talk by people a lot smarter than me, but those same smart people, have put together a lot of analysis that clearly demonstrate that solutions are not lacking in solving our fiscal gap, that what is lacking is a political will to put revenues into the equation. So, on this very topic, I wanted to highlight this insight that comes from 2 of our Alaska legislative leaders. And this quote is from an op-ed that Kathy Giesel and House Speaker Bryce Edgman wrote after the second special session dealing with lowering the PFD to 1,600. And I find it's interesting that they too come back to this oil analogy, you know. To continue expecting other people to stock the fridge and fill the car with gas is to remain trapped in a dream world paid for by endless oil that will never return. So assuming that our leaders put revenues in the mix to solve the fiscal gap, it becomes possible to take the next step in moving beyond oil, which is building on our economic strengths: seafood, tourism, healthcare, and native corporations, all those I was just talking about. Instead of hoping to go back to the future through more oil, Alaska should pay attention to where the rest of the world is going and embrace the opportunities of a world moving to a low-carbon economy. I know we all fear change, and sometimes it's hard to let go of what you've always known. I get it. But when you see headlines like this in the business magazine like Forbes and read on that oil would have to be priced at $10 to $20 a barrel to remain competitive as a transport fuel, then you sense that change is inevitable, and we might as well figure out how best to deal with it. A Saudi Arabian oil minister, his name was Sheikh Yamini, he once said, "The Stone Age did not end for lack of stones. And the oil age will end long before the world runs out of oil." It's interesting that he made this observation well before 195 countries signed on to an international agreement to reduce emissions from fossil fuels. I want to also kind of go back to the renewable energy aspect of things, and I find it was fascinating to me to learn that when I looked at what was going on in states that have embraced the clean energy economy, like Washington, Oregon, and California, that their clean sector economy, the parts of their economy that are focused on energy efficiency and renewable energy jobs, that part of the economy is growing at twice the rate as the rest of their economy. And along with British Columbia, these states created the Pacific Coast Action Plan for Climate and Energy. Alaska once sat as an observer to this climate initiative. Now we're absent altogether and continue missing out on the phenomenal economic growth that our neighbors are experiencing. A 2009 Union of Concerned Scientists study found that renewable energy policy to have 25% of a region's electricity come from renewable energy would create more than 3 times as many jobs as producing an equivalent amount of electricity from fossil fuels. That's a 3-to-1 job ratio gain in focusing on renewable energy projects. And in my book, that's worth seizing. We are also missing out on the investment opportunity created by green banks. How many people here have heard of green banks? Okay, good. A green bank is a public or quasi-public finance authority that uses innovative financing techniques to jumpstart private clean energy and energy efficiency projects. Green banks seek to, 1, reduce energy costs for ratepayers, 2, to stimulate private sector investment, and 3, to expedite the transition to a low-carbon economy. And they have a track record of success. Green banks around the world have driven approximately $30 billion of clean energy investments. Here in the US, there are 5 states and 1 county-based green bank. In 2011, the state of Connecticut set up the first green bank in the US, and in its first 4 years of existence, the Connecticut Green Bank has stimulated an investment of over $660 million in clean energy projects, the vast majority of which were private dollars. And here's a snapshot, comparison of the types of return that the Connecticut Green Bank is getting. And if you look closer, you'll see some of these rates of return are for like every $1 public dollar spent, there's 9, 10, and even 20 private dollars. And you remember that $1 billion of energy waste that Alaskans are just burning up the smokestack? Well, it seems that we would have a lot of projects that would be eligible for green bank financing. Our projects may not get the same high rate of return, but $3 to $4 for every $1 public dollar is still a solid return. And this does not count the thousands of jobs that could be generated by energy efficiency projects. These are the economic benefits we're losing out on by hitching Alaska's future to the dubious resurgence of oil. We're also losing out on carbon reduction benefits by not engaging on climate, by not being willing to think green. Just as the native corporations received millions of dollars for keeping coal in the ground and for not cutting their old growth timber, the state of Alaska could do the same. In other words, thinking green actually equates to money in the general fund. Instead of more oil, we need to think about less carbon. And in this regard, there are some exciting developments in the efforts to draw down or remove carbon from the atmosphere. And one of them actually uses natural gas. Here's a TED Talk that explains what he calls the origin power process, where it feeds natural gas into a fuel cell. And about half the chemical energy is converted into electricity, and the remainder into heat, which is used to break down limestone into lime and carbon dioxide. And then all of the carbon dioxide generated, both from the fuel cell and from the lime kiln, is pure. And that's really important, because it means you can either use the carbon dioxide or you can store it deep underground at very low cost. And then the lime that you produce can be used in industrial processes, and in being used, it scrubs carbon dioxide out of the air. Overall, the process is carbon negative. It removes carbon dioxide from the air. Is this something that our huge stores of natural gas can be used for? I don't know. As I've been emailing this researcher with these types of questions, and I've never gotten a response. I imagine if the governor inquired, he would get a response. So while I don't know if this is really practical for our gas, I do know that these are the types of opportunities we, as a state, are not exploring because of our fixation with big oil as usual. This is a path forward to moving beyond oil. We can solve the fiscal gap. We can build on our economic strengths. As I said earlier, we may have been funded by oil, but we were founded on fish. And our foundation of fish remains strong. We have more than one economic driver, and we too have the resources and capabilities to join the clean energy economy. We are resilient Alaskans who ride out earthquakes. If Alaska joined in with the rest of the world and fully embraced the clean energy economy, we could not only be the last frontier, but the best frontier. Thank you. So now to the fun part, questions and dialogue. I hope I kind of piqued some of your curiosity about some of the opportunities that lay ahead, and at the same time assure you that we have plenty of economic strengths to build upon. You know, we don't have to be shaking like, oh no, what are we going to do? Where's our next oil fix going to come from? We got to get out of that thinking, and we can do that. So, questions? Okay. It's coming.
Thank you, Kate. Didn't the permanent fund just give something like $200 million from the permanent fund to investment possibilities within the state, with an in-state fiscal manager and an out-of-state fiscal manager? Am I wrong about the numbers there? It seems to me that the things that we know would really work for Alaska, some of the things that you're talking about, ought to be put into a proposal for development and making money within the state of Alaska. Do you know what I'm talking? You know what I'm talking about.
Not exactly, Kay. I mean, I don't know what the Permanent Fund Board has done in that regard. I know that they're not using environmental or governance criteria to evaluate their portfolios.
Well, yes, and we also know that there has been a fairly strong movement within Alaska to get them to divest. But this is just this has just happened very, very recently. Does anybody else know about this? The numbers are accurate? Well, they need.
Okay, well, we have an answer for what they can invest in. Yeah.
Another sector that's completely overlooked is e-commerce, and it's not something that's necessarily going to create a huge boom, but it's something that would really strengthen a lot of businesses and a lot of individuals. And it could work in two ways. One is that it can be used to augment people's businesses of things that are produced in Alaska, such as Taku Smokeries, I think, has a huge business in sending smoked fish out all over the country. Especially, so Christmas is probably a huge season for them. And also it can be used to do business remotely with products that you never even see. So for example, Amazon at one time went to China and decided to recruit a bunch of sellers, and now Amazon is filled with Chinese sellers, and these people have never been to the United States and maybe don't even speak English, and yet they're thriving on that in that marketplace. But the obstacles to this happening are that right now it's a situation where every single business has to learn e-commerce from the ground up, and people are often too busy to devote the energy to it. And then there's a chamber of commerce, but there's no chamber of e-commerce. And I think that the major institutions for promoting business in Alaska don't really have a good understanding of e-commerce and don't know how to promote it. And so that's a sector that people could do from Alaska and could do remotely and have products that they never even see that are sent from wherever to either from Alaska down to warehouses down south, or from sourcing from other places down south and then drop shipping. It just needs a lot of training and maybe some help with logistics, because the logistics here are very poor. So that's another area that could be promoted.
Yeah, and just to add a comment to that, I see Brian Holst here with the Juneau Economic Development Corporation, and I know that Brian's very tuned into the e-commerce and trying to encourage entrepreneurs and creating some platforms for them to network on. So we obviously can do more of that. I think we had a question back there, and then, okay. Hi,
Thanks,
Joy.
Kate. I was wondering about the $1 billion that we're losing to waste, and how much of that is due to home heating and some of the new Juneau carbon offset program of heat exchangers. Is that going to, would that be solving, is it mostly, do you think, home heating? Is it running your car while you're sitting at the bank, waiting? Where is all that loss, that $1 billion, and how can we address that best? Maybe I should pass it over to you, Duff.
Most of that is in the residential and commercial buildings, is where most of that $1 billion gets wasted away. I don't know if you remember, Governor Palin actually created a program to finance energy audits and give Alaskans up to $7,000, to redo their home, and that was a big success. A lot of people jumped on it and created a lot of jobs, and then she went away and the program went away. But that's the type of programs we need to bring back. And you're right, the carbon offset thing is even a plus on it. I'm being vague about the carbon offset, and what that's a reference to is Renewable Juneau has created a program to help people can fund air source heat pumps for low-income families, and do that as a way to offset their air travel or anything else that they do. And there's a website where, Steve, you can say. JuneauCarbonOffset.org. And that's a grassroots way of funding to try and capture that waste, but really what we need is at the state level, major funding, or the establishment of a green bank. It's a quasi-public situation, and so it needs enabling legislation and a little bit of upfront funding, but that's a huge opportunity, and the president of the Connecticut Green Bank has come to Alaska twice to talk up this idea, and I know he's getting some interest among some legislators.
Hi, I know we spoke a lot about how cheap renewables have become in recent years, and I'm wondering, particularly in small kind of rural communities in Alaska, how do you see power cost equalization still being there? How do you see renewables being able to compete with that, particularly in small communities where energy usage is lower?
Yeah, what we have out in a lot of rural Alaska is a hybrid system to where we have wind diesel combinations or small hydro diesel combinations. And we now have DC lines that connect the villages, so they're getting better electrical transmission between one village and the other, and less waste. So our villages have really come quite a ways in being able to rely on renewable energy. And it's a hybrid system, so that, you know, when you don't have enough of the wind or enough of the hydro, you know, you can go back to your diesel for backup. But what prompted a lot of that push in rural Alaska is when the price of diesel went up to $30 a gallon. You know, that was exorbitant. So now they're doing a lot better, and there's still more opportunities out there in rural Alaska. Some of it is biomass. Most of it is wind, and small in-stream hydro are the most lucrative opportunities for rural Alaska. Steve.
Kate, thank you for your big picture perspective. And given that you've kind of got this great range of experience in Alaska, from kind of the state scale down to your service on the Assembly, dealing with some of these issues here in Juneau's capital city, which gets just 1 million plus visitors a year. Could you talk a little bit about what opportunities you would see here in Juneau for helping to kind of move some of this along?
That would be called a softball question. Thank you. I like those. And actually, the mic needs to go to Sally next. She's been raising her hand there. So, yeah, the opportunities. Well, one of the most immediate thing is electrification for the cruise ships industry. That's, you know, the cruise ship greenhouse emissions. That's our biggest contributor to greenhouse gases in Juneau. And then there are the exciting projects like, you know, downtown district heating. Thank you. I knew that there was another word. And hopefully there's going to be some new exciting developments along that line by Mr. Keith Comstock. If you want to make an announcement of any kind yet, okay. But so downtown district heating is a huge opportunity. I think also one of the things that we're missing out on is educating the visitors. There was a long time when you didn't really want to talk to people about climate change. You know, I was a guide for gas snow guiding for two summers, and you know, you're showing them the glacier, they see how much it's reduced, and we're like, oh, we're not supposed to talk about this, but hello, it's right there in your face. And then I would start to talk to them about what they could do at home, you know, and people didn't seem to be bothered by that. And so I think there's a lot more we could do to educate the actual visitors one-on-one. Now you see this at home, take it back to your own community, to your own home, and make those individual choices. Connect the experience of seeing the Mendenhall Hall shrink and what that means to your own life. So I think there's lots of opportunity for continuing to educate them. And maybe we can get them to participate in the carbon offset program, right? That's what you were waiting for. That was the plug. That would be great. Thanks.
Hi, this is kind of two comments related to fiscal policy in Alaska. The decision or the possibility of the permanent fund investing a part of its portfolio in Alaska businesses, to me seems in violation of any principle of investment management that I've ever learned or been associated with. So I'm not in agreement with that. I'd certainly be willing to listen to other people's opinions. The other comment that I'd like to make also deals with fiscal policy. One of the things that businesses hate is an uncertain tax environment, especially if they're making huge investments in a particular area. Since I've been in Alaska for about 25 years, we've had so many different tax proposals. How are we going to tax the oil companies? We need a change in our tax policy. Could that be one of the reasons that BP has pulled out of Alaska, because of the great uncertainty in taxes? And how will this affect our plans in the future? Thank you.
Well, that would be another whole talk if I get into oil taxes and revenues, but I will make a short comment, Sally, in that my understanding, when I've looked at the profitability of these international companies, in that Alaska is a huge profit center for them. They are doing well, making good money here. So they're not BP did not leave because they weren't making enough money here in Alaska. Remember I mentioned about this, the thing about stranded assets. So if you're a big international oil company and you've been drilling and working that oil field for a long time, and it's getting down to its dwindling state, and if you could sell off that last little bit and still make money, that's an opportunity to be had. So I just think it was just smart business planning, because they were very fearful of the stranded assets. One of the things that I found most interesting is there was a study done by the University of College London, and they looked at all the known oil and gas reserves around the world and did an economic model based on what are the most reserves that are most likely to be economical in terms of proximity to market, in terms of infrastructure, and viability of the field. And then they overlaid the Paris Climate Accord on that. So if we have to stay below 2 degrees, this analysis was done for 2 degrees centigrade and not the 1.5 that we're focused on now. But even at that point in time, so they looked down and they said, okay, where is that line of the oil and gas that we can afford to burn and still have a chance of meeting the terms of the Paris Climate Accord? And when I looked at that line, guess what's way below that line? Offshore Arctic. Developing the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, didn't even make it. So if you're just looking from the standpoint of strict economics of where are you going to look for oil, you have to pay attention to the whole global scene of where that oil likely is going to be most useful and not be stranded. So the oil companies are really faced, and they're struggling with this whole concept of stranded assets, because they've got those reserves on their books and then their audits. And if you take them off, they're going to look less. They're going to look less profitable. But the way the world, in the way we are moving, we have to keep significant amounts of those oil and gas reserves in the ground if we have any chance at all of meeting the terms of the Paris Climate Accord. So my gut sense, I haven't talked to BP directly, but my gut sense is they just made a smart business move and wanted to sell off their remaining assets before they became too stranded.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi, yeah, and to add on to what you were saying, with BP's sale of oil, they also sold to Hilcorp, which I think as a local company, I believe, they're exempt from a lot of the taxes that BP had to pay to Alaska, if I remember right. My question, though, however, is with a significant portion of our economy, not just oil, but mining, logging, fishing, a lot of the money that we do have coming through here is coming from outside interests. It's coming from multinational corporations. And a lot of that ends up making Alaska, in a lot of ways, like a third world country with an extractive economy, an economy that relies on outside interest, outside corporations and like multinational corporations coming in, exploiting those resources, extracting those as much as they can, with the least amount going back into the economy as possible. And right now, with our administration and with the policies that we have in place, is there a way to change our economy from having one that's dictated and controlled by outside interests to something that revolves more, is more circular to Alaska?
That's a big question as well. And I'm going to go back to where I kind of started this talk, was like looking at what has changed since the pipeline first came along. And I know within the seafood industry, we have made a lot of structural changes to where there's more Alaskans' interest in owning those companies. You know, a lot of the quota got assigned to communities. So we have made great strides in changing the international structure within the seafood industry. I think there's some of that still going on with the tourism industry. Obviously, we have bigger, the cruise ship industry is not owned by Alaskans, but we do have a lot of small boat tours, and we have a lot of niche operators that are all owned by Alaskans. I spoke about the maturation of the native and regional and village corporations, and through them, we've captured more of that economic investment in jobs here. So since the pipeline days, we've come quite far in my book in trying to return and keep those dollars here. Yes, there's still more to be done, but I'm actually encouraged at the trend line. Question here, and then
Do I
back
have to stand up?
No, just speak
Okay.
in the microphone.
Yeah. I have a question regarding what I generally term conspicuous consumption, large houses, conspicuous flying and travel, and how much that actually plays into the climate change picture, and if there isn't some way could encourage the old idea of small is beautiful and less is more. Is there some way you could, as a municipality, encourage, say, sharing of homes for young people who can't even find a place, and use of less energy, or dividing it up amongst more people? And how much does that actually affect the whole climate change picture, what the individual is doing? I've heard 2% for flying, for instance, of the climate warming, global warming is caused by flying, for instance.
Yeah, the last sort of interesting study that I read was actually today, sitting in the sun. The Time magazine has a special on the climate and the earth, and it talked about how individual actions, I think, comprise about 6% of the world's carbon emissions, and by that it means, you know, what you're eating, and you know, food waste is a big problem. So if we eat less beef, can deal with food waste a lot better. Smaller homes, more efficient homes. You know, we have a lot of large homes that only 2 people live in. So there are lots of individual actions that people can take. Certainly, electric vehicles. How many people here have electric vehicles here? Yeah, look at this. Now, if I had asked this question 2 years ago, maybe I'd get a handful. Yeah, and that's the way the trend line is going. Jeff Goodell, he's a reporter for Rolling Stone magazine, and he wrote an interesting article after the Paris Climate Accord. And one of the things that he took away from that whole agreement was that in the end, it all comes down to individual actions. Yes, we need some right policy to spur us in that direction, and reward us and create the right incentives. And probably one of the most important mechanisms for doing that is to place a price on carbon. Then you use the marketplace to effect those types of changes. So in my mind, the biggest thing we could do to foster individual actions on a policy level is to deal with putting a price on carbon. And then just rewarding yourselves for, taking those types of things. If you can get tax write-offs for your energy improvement projects on your house, those are great things. What are we doing in the agricultural industry to help them transition to, a more carbon-intensive way of farming? There are lots of ideas and solutions out there. And what we are lacking, though, is the policy to help drive those solutions forward, at least here in the United States. Europe is on another whole level,
Greens Creek burns 10,000 gallons of oil a day. Kensington burns 10,000 gallons of oil a day. If you'd really like to cut 20,000 gallons a day of oil out of the Juneau economy, you'd insist that Snettisham or Sweetheart Hydro be put online.
Absolutely.
I'm an old hydropower engineer.
Yes. It's something that I've paid close attention to and been a little bit frustrated in how Alaska Electric Light and Power has dragged their feet to inhibit the timeliness of bringing Sweetheart Lake into our system. And that's what we also need for the cruise ship electrification. It's a viable project, and the sooner it comes online, the better we will all be off.
Hi, I'm a dean here at the college, so I want to ask an educational question. But before I do that, I wanted to make a comment that Tim Kruger used to give lectures in a program I ran. So
so
I'm
you
happy
have
to run
access to him.
Okay. If you want to try to get him here.
Well,
but,
I would love to. I watched that TED Talk and I was just amazed at it, and it just, my head just kept. The ideas just kept spinning around, and I really would love to try and figure out if that is a viable project for our natural gas.
Okay, well.
So I'll get in touch and you can help me.
He was lecturing about another scheme a couple of years ago, so he's moved on. But my question is about really education and consumption. So we talk a lot about policy initiatives and getting a carbon market right. And changing the source of production of energy. We don't talk a lot about demand reduction, but you may have heard of the rebound effect or Jevons paradox that sort of says, we'll build a bigger house if energy's cheaper, right? And we'll use just as much as we can afford. And so isn't there really a bigger consumption issue behind this? In other words, wouldn't a general consumption tax maybe be the ultimate solution? That's one part of it. And isn't the other big problem energy literacy? I mean, we don't teach people about energy, how they consume it, where the big uses are. Most people, especially in Alaska, are pretty energy illiterate. Well, maybe not especially in Alaska, but in the US, I would say. But all across the industrialized world, people generally don't know that much about where their energy comes from, how much it really costs in terms of environment, and what the alternatives are. So one is a consumption question in general, and the other is literacy. How do we improve both?
And how do I solve all the world's problems? That's just us two, okay. On the consumption thing, definitely we are a society that has always thought, more is better. And we need to have more education that, less is actually better. And one of the ways that my experience, like with the Marine Stewardship Eco-Label, is to be able to, to have our products be more certified as to whether or not they're sustainable, what is their carbon imprint on that. and in particularly in Europe now, you see a lot more of that type of labeling for your carbon calculation in almost anything you buy. If you're going to buy, some piece of clothing that comes from China, you need to account for the shipment cost, and those are techniques I think that we can do to educate people is to be able to, have those type of consumer informations directly on our products as to how much carbon is being used by these various products, so that you're making the smartest choice possible. You're using your wallet to affect the change. And the second part of the question? Energy literacy. Yeah. Well, there are things called smart meters. I think it would be a smart move for us to, for the state of Alaska to actually invest and pay for smart meters to go in everybody's homes. Because when you actually can see diagrammically, how much energy you're using and saving, then it starts to translate, and you can feel that impact. Right now with the growth in artificial intelligence and remote sensing, we are learning how to fine-tune things a lot better so that they become more efficient, and we have that feedback loop. So I'm expecting that we're going to see a lot more products that are going to do that type of registering for us, and so we see it in our everyday life. Probably on our smartphones. I'm sure there are carbon apps that we can program into, but for me, the first thing is to create a sense of that we're all in this together. It's all hands on deck. We all have to do our part, no matter how small or how large. The change that we've made in our home by putting in the air source heat pump and now driving an electric vehicle. Yeah, is that changing the world? No, but it's one important step, and collectively, it makes a huge, big difference. And I think now that in Juneau, we can just see the ripple effect of that kind of change. As you're driving around, you see more electric cars, and hey, I think I'll get one too. So I think some of that is going to come along as our products get better labeled and more sophisticated. Yes.
Thank you. On incentivizing lower consumption, that's often given as the purpose of a carbon tax. And yet several jurisdictions have made the carbon tax essentially revenue neutral. I think BC is one of them, where the revenues collected don't become a source for investment in renewable energy. They're rebated back as credits on your income tax or something like that. So while they might shift consumption, I think it's debatable as to whether they really reduce it, and they certainly don't provide a source of investment capital for renewable energy. It's just something to keep in mind if we should ever, in Alaska, begin to consider a carbon tax. It's often considered to be more politically palatable if it's made revenue neutral, but has much less effect in my view. Thanks.
You're right, it does. And to get a carbon tax first established in North America was a very heavy lift. And so when British Columbia came up with a scheme to make it revenue neutral and give some of the money back to the ratepayers and lower their electrical bills, then it became very popular. And now the next time when British Columbia, when their carbon tax came back up for renewal, because they had a sunset date on it, guess what? The citizens said, hey, we don't need to make this carbon revenue neutral anymore. Let's use some of the excess money to fund renewable energy projects. So that's what British Columbia is doing now with their carbon tax. So there was an evolution, a maturation of that policy. Sometimes you have to do the first simple step because of the policy heavy lift, and then hopefully the economics and the desire to make a better Earth will take over for the better policy call. That's the example we have from British Columbia.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I am inspired by what I now know as Generation Z, which are the 20-somethings. In the summer, I worked with a man who is collecting data on how to market to Generation Z. And so it was interesting that the questions that he was asking, because he was an older guy, like I am an older woman, and were met with totally off the wall answers in that so many young people that I've met recently are just not buying anything. It's like, I'm gonna do a year of not buying any clothes, not buying, you know, just you making my clothes out of things that I already have, remodeling, repackaging things, growing my own food. And this whole group of young people that are in our town now that are coming up with help and, you know, sustainable salt and soil. And I just wanted
And
to
Juneau
do a
compost
shout, and
is another
Juneau
one.
compost.
Yeah.
Just, I wanted to put a shout out to, you know, this younger generation that we should be listening to.
I have a, thank you for bringing that point up, because I have a book, and I actually brought a few books, and I'll be happy to sign them. But one of the points I make in my book is that one of the biggest points of hope is what the younger generation is doing, and how they get this, and they are willing to make the changes not only you know, in their community, but on an individual level, and you know, they're angry, and at the same time they're very creative. So I place a lot of hope in the younger generation. I just still feel at the same time, though, I'm letting them down, you know, because I think particularly we in the state can do a whole lot more. You know, as my introduction indicated, I've been involved in climate policy for like over 10 years now. It's going on 12 or 13 years. And Alaska has always been put out there as the poster state for climate impacts. You know, we are ground zero, we have the Arctic, we have the sea ice, the permafrost melting, and all of that. And it's been a real point of consternation and frustration that we're also the poster state for climate inaction. You know, we're one of we are the only region on the entire Pacific coast, from Mexico to Alaska, that does not have a climate action plan being implemented, you know. And we should have been the first ones out there. And so that's what prompted this talk a little bit, because I kept, why do we keep running up against this obstacle? And that is because, you know, we're just so ingrained with oil. You know, we can't deal with this other side of climate because we're an oil state. You know, and I hope to change that dialogue, because we need to go where the rest of the world is, and we can get there if we flip our channel, alter our thinking and our perspective. That would be helpful, yes.
Hi. So, yeah, bringing up Greta and Generation Z, I find that really interesting, because I think a lot of what our younger generations are saying right now is that capitalism itself isn't working. The free market hasn't been working for us, and it's led to a lot of destruction of our homes and a lot of destruction of our futures. A lot of people in this room are going to be gone in the next 20 years. And so younger people like myself are still going to be around here, suffering the effects of things like the mines destroying our salmon streams, global warming destroying what's the life is in the ocean. It just seems like I'm having a really hard time feeling like capitalism is the solution to problems that capitalism's created in the first place. I know earlier I mentioned that our economy is really exploitative, but I mean, this oil industry is in here specifically because of the free market saying that they can come in here, that a cruise ship can come in and buy land and create another dock without any input from us here in Juneau, that the mines can pollute and with very little oversight get little slaps on the wrist when something like Kensington comes in and goes over their limits for the wastewater tailings ponds they have, when
yeah, the list can go on and on, and
on,
it can get
really can.
get really depressing in a heartbeat here. So one of the things I try to do, and I accomplished it in my book, is I like to plant hope spots. You know, yeah, capitalism does have its problems, but the marketplace can also be a change agent if we put the right parameters on it. You know, so that's one of the reasons why I brought up that point about grid parity. You know, here we have capitalism is working in the wrong way because we're providing subsidies of, you know, a huge amount to the oil and gas industry, and yet, you know, through entrepreneurship and creative innovation and just dog-heartedness, we now have, you know, solar and wind, you know, reaching grid parity, and that is shifting the way the whole energy scene is looked at. Those are very positive developments. So I like to bring those up because those other concerns you talked about are very legitimate, but we can't lose hope, because if we don't have hope, then it's really all over. And I think what I want to leave you with is a message of hope that we can move beyond oil. And I think we're pretty much done with comments on that one. Thank you.